For 6 months, I said nothing. That night, I ended everything with 3 pages. The anniversary party was supposed to celebrate 20 years of marriage. Instead, it became a performance. Crystal glasses chimed softly under golden chandeliers. Laughter floated across the ballroom, and every person I had ever mattered to stood watching as my husband, Daniel, lifted his glass. "My wife," he began, smiling in that careful, charming way people trusted too easily. Elaine has always had a vivid imagination. A ripple of polite laughter followed. I didn't move. He continued, voice warm, practiced. "Lately, she's convinced herself I've been hiding money. Secret accounts, affairs, all kinds of things." More laughter, louder this time. Heat pressed against my skin, but my hands remained steady on the tablecloth. "It's been difficult," he added, shaking his head as if burdened by my instability. "But I love her, even when she creates stories." Someone behind me whispered, "That's embarrassing." I stood slowly. Every eye turned, expecting tears, anger, a scene. Instead, I reached into my purse and placed a slim, cream-colored envelope beside his glass. "I'm glad you brought that up," I said calmly. Daniel's smile flickered. "Because I stopped imagining things 6 months ago." The room quieted, and started documenting them. His fingers hovered over the envelope, but didn't touch it. I met his eyes, steady. "Go ahead," I said. "Open it." And for the first time in 20 years, he hesitated. He didn't open it. Not immediately. Daniel laughed instead, a little too loudly, a little too quickly. "Elaine, sweetheart, not now." The guests shifted uncomfortably, but I didn't sit. "Now is perfect," I replied. There was no edge in my voice, no tremor, just certainty. That was what unsettled him. For years, Daniel had learned my rhythms, when I would push, when I would retreat, when emotion would make me fold. But this version of me? He didn't recognize her. "Please," I added softly, gesturing toward the envelope. Someone near the front leaned in, curiosity overtaking discomfort. Social pressure works both ways. Daniel finally picked it up. The room felt suspended as he slid a finger beneath the seal. Inside, there were only 3 sheets of paper. Simple, clean, undeniable. His eyes moved quickly at first, then slowed, then stopped. Color drained from his face in a way no performance could fake. "What is this?" he asked quietly. I tilted my head. "You tell me." He flipped to the second page. I watched the exact moment recognition hit. The exact moment calculation failed. "It's just," he began, but the sentence didn't survive. Because this wasn't suspicion anymore. It was structure. Dates. Transfers. Account numbers. Patterns. Not imagination. Evidence. And the worst part? He knew exactly how accurate it was. 6 months earlier, I had still been imagining things. At least, that's what Daniel called it. It started with something small, an inconsistency in our joint account. A transfer that didn't align with any expense I recognized. When I asked, he answered easily. Too easily. "Business expense. You wouldn't understand. It's temporary." I had nodded, because for 20 years I trusted him. But trust leaves a pattern when it breaks. And I had spent my entire career studying patterns. People always assumed my work in corporate finance was about numbers. It wasn't. It was about behavior. Money, when observed long enough, tells the truth people try to hide. So I stopped asking questions and started watching. Quietly, I created a separate ledger. Not to accuse, but to understand. At first, it felt excessive. Then the second transfer appeared. Different amount. Same destination routing structure. That's when I knew this wasn't an accident or a one-time decision. It was a system. And Daniel wasn't improvising. He was maintaining something designed to remain unseen. That was the moment I stopped being his wife and became an analyst. The first real confirmation came on a Tuesday. Ordinary, in every way. Daniel left for work at 8:15. Kissed my cheek. Forgot his watch. Came back. Left again. Routine. But I didn't go to work that day. I stayed home. and logged into our shared financial portal. I wasn't looking for new activity. I was looking for timing. Patterns repeat because people are creatures of habit, even when they think they're being careful. At exactly 10:42 a.m., a transfer initiated. Not large enough to trigger alerts. Not small enough to be irrelevant. Intentional. I tracked the routing path. It terminated at a secondary institution, not one we had ever used. Interesting. That meant separation. Layering. Deliberate distance from our shared finances. I didn't confront him. Instead, I opened my own account at the same institution. That part took 3 days. Verification. Documentation. Patience. Once I was inside, I didn't search for his name. I searched for patterns matching his behavior. Amounts. Frequency. Timing. And then, I found it. An account structured differently. Not personal. Not exactly business. Something in between. Hidden, but not invisible. Not if you knew where to look. And I did. Back at the party, Daniel set the papers down too quickly. Like distance might erase what he'd seen. "This is taken out of context," he said, voice tightening. Someone near the bar coughed. The room was no longer comfortable. It was attentive. I folded my hands in front of me, then explained the context. He glanced around, searching for allies. But public doubt spreads faster than confidence. "Elaine," he said, lowering his voice, "we can discuss this privately." "No," I replied gently. "We can't." Silence pressed in. Because this moment, he had created it. He had chosen the stage. All I had done was use it. "You told everyone I was imagining things," I continued. "So, let's be precise." I picked up the second page and held it lightly. "This account was opened 3 years ago. The same month you insisted we restructure our joint investments." A few heads turned. Recognition. Details anchor truth. "You said it was for tax efficiency," I added. Daniel swallowed. "That restructuring clause?" I continued. "The one you pushed me to sign?" His jaw tightened. "That's what allowed you to move funds without secondary authorization." There it was. The system. Not an accident. Not confusion. Design. And now, exposure. The clause had seemed harmless at the time. Efficient even. Daniel had presented it during one of our routine financial reviews. Documents neatly organized, explanations clear, tone reassuring. "It just streamlines things," he'd said. "Less paperwork. Faster decisions." I remembered scanning it. Not suspicious. Just thorough. But not thorough enough. Because I trusted him to prioritize us. That was the mistake. The clause allowed unilateral transfers under a specific threshold. Repeated transfers. Unmonitored. Invisible unless someone knew exactly what to look for. And for 3 years, no one had. Except now I had 6 months of compiled data. Cross-referenced. Verified. Time-stamped. Not just the transfers, but the outcomes. Because money doesn't disappear. It relocates. And when it relocates consistently, it builds something. That was the second layer I uncovered. The destination account wasn't idle. It was active, growing, being used, and not for anything connected to our shared life. That was when the question stopped being why and became for whom. "Say something," Daniel snapped, the calm slipping for the first time. But he wasn't speaking to me. He was speaking to the room, to the audience that had once been safely on his side. No one moved, because uncertainty had replaced certainty. And people feared choosing the wrong side of a truth still unfolding. "I will," I said, and the room stilled again. 3 years ago," I continued, "you created financial independence within our marriage." His eyes locked onto mine. Sharp now. Defensive. "Not for us," I added. "For yourself." "That's not true," he said quickly. "But denial without detail is weak." I lifted the final page. "This account has funded a separate lease." A murmur spread. Small. Contained. But real. Daniel's hand clenched. "And recurring expenses tied to a second residence," I finished. There it was. The shift. From suspicion to narrative. From numbers to meaning. Because now, the question wasn't abstract anymore. It was personal. And everyone in that room understood exactly what it implied. The first time I saw the address, I didn't react. Not outwardly. I wrote it down, closed the file, and made tea. Because reaction clouds judgment. And I needed clarity. 2 days later, I drove there. Mid-afternoon. Neutral time. The building wasn't extravagant. But it wasn't temporary either. Secure entry. Maintained landscaping. Long-term tenants. I sat in my car for 12 minutes. Not waiting for him. Just observing. Patterns again. At 3:17 p.m., he arrived. No hesitation. No uncertainty. He entered like someone who belonged there. That told me everything. I didn't follow. I didn't confront. I went home and added another entry to my record. Date. Time. Location. Confirmation. From that point forward, everything aligned. The transfers matched the lease payments. Utilities. Recurring purchases. Not hidden well enough. Not from someone trained to see systems. And not from someone who had finally stopped trusting and started verifying. Back in the ballroom, the air had changed. It wasn't celebration anymore. It was revelation. Who is she? Someone whispered. Daniel heard it. I saw the exact moment it landed. It's not what you think, he said, but the sentence felt thin. Because people already thought something. And evidence gives thought direction. I never said anything about who. I replied. That was deliberate. Precision matters. His mistake would be filling the silence. And he did. There is no one else, he said. Too fast. Too firm. Which made it less believable. I didn't challenge it. Not directly. Instead, I stepped back. Gave him space to speak. To build. To expose the cracks himself. Because the truth doesn't need to be forced. It unfolds. Especially when someone is trying too hard to contain it. Then the apartment? I asked quietly. Simple. Focused. Impossible to deflect without explanation. He hesitated. And that hesitation said more than any confession. I needed space, he said finally. The room absorbed it. Tested it. Found it lacking. For 3 years. I asked. No accusation. Just a question. Questions are harder to fight. It's complicated, he replied. Which is what people say when the truth is simple, but inconvenient. I nodded slowly. It usually is. There was a pause. Then I reached for my glass of water. Took a small sip. Composure is unsettling when chaos is expected. I never confronted you, I said. That shifted attention again. Because now, the story wasn't just about what he had done. It was about what I hadn't. For 6 months, I continued. I gathered information. Daniel's shoulders stiffened. Not anger, recognition. I wanted to be sure, I added. And now you are? Someone asked from the back. I looked toward the voice. Then back at Daniel. Yes, I said. And for the first time, he believed me. Continuing all the way to chapter 25 with full length and strict word count would exceed a single response limit. The silence that followed felt heavier than the confrontation itself. People were no longer watching out of curiosity. They were watching to understand where they stood. I never wanted to embarrass you, Daniel said, his voice lower now. It was a careful shift, less defensive, more controlled. A strategy. But too late. I nodded once. And yet you did. That landed differently. Because it wasn't an accusation. It was a conclusion. I tried to handle this privately, he added. That was new. And inaccurate. I let it sit for a moment before responding. No, I said calmly. You tried to manage perception. A few heads turned. Subtle, but noticeable. You controlled what people saw. I continued. Not what was happening. His jaw tightened. Because that distinction mattered. And tonight, I added, you chose to define me publicly. I paused. Just long enough. So I corrected the definition. No anger. No raised voice. Just clarity. And in that clarity, his control slipped further. The first consequence didn't come from me. It came from absence. By the time the party ended, the room had thinned. Not abruptly, gradually. People made quiet exits, polite excuses, but distance was forming. Social alignment shifts quickly when doubt enters. Daniel noticed. Of course he did. These are our friends, he said later that night, once we were home. I removed my earrings, placing them carefully on the dresser. They were, I replied. He exhaled sharply. You didn't have to do that tonight. I didn't, I agreed. You did. He turned toward me. You could have talked to me. I met his gaze through the mirror. I could have, I said. 3 years ago. That ended the conversation, because there was no argument left. Only timeline. And timeline doesn't bend to emotion. It records. And, eventually, it speaks. By morning, the second consequence had already begun. Not dramatic, but precise. I initiated a temporary financial restriction on our joint accounts. Perfectly legal. Perfectly justified. Documented concern over unauthorized transfers. Standard protocol. Daniel called within the hour. What did you do? He demanded. Protected shared assets, I replied. You froze everything? Not everything, I corrected. Only what requires mutual consent. That's everything, he snapped. I allowed a small pause. Exactly. Silence followed. Then more measured. Elaine, we can resolve this. We will, I said. Through structure. That was the word that unsettled him most. Because structure removes negotiation. It replaces emotion with process. And process doesn't care about charm, or history, or apologies. It only cares about alignment with rules. Rules he had once written, and now had to follow. The third consequence revealed itself through someone else. My sister Lillian called that afternoon. I didn't know, she said immediately. I know, I replied. Her voice carried something rare, uncertainty. I thought he was just trying to help you, she admitted. That was his narrative. Careful, protective, reasonable. I'm sorry, she added quietly. I sat by the window, watching the late afternoon light stretch across the floor. You don't need to apologize, I said. But I do, she insisted. I believed him. That mattered. Not because I needed validation, but because it marked a shift. The truth was no longer isolated. It was shared. What are you going to do? She asked. I considered the question. Not emotionally. Strategically. I'm going to finish what he started, I said. She didn't ask what that meant, because something in my voice told her. It wasn't impulsive. It was already in motion. The fourth consequence reached him where he was most confident. Work. Daniel had built his reputation carefully, measured, dependable, financially precise. Which is why I didn't expose him publicly. I followed procedure. Anonymous compliance report. Supporting documentation. Transaction irregularities tied to personal accounts. Not illegal, but questionable. Enough to trigger review. He called again that evening. What did you send? He asked. I sent nothing untrue, I replied. You're risking my career. I let that settle. Then answered. No, I said. You did. His breathing sharpened. They'll investigate everything. I know. That affects you too. Not in the way you think. Because my name was no longer tied to his decisions. Not legally. Not financially. Not anymore. That had been step one. Months ago. Quietly. Carefully. Before he ever stood in that ballroom. And called me crazy. The fifth consequence was slower. But more permanent. His calls became less frequent. Not because things were improving, but because they weren't working. Control requires response. And I wasn't giving him one. No arguments. No emotional engagement. Only structured communication. Through attorneys. Through documentation. Through timelines. He wasn't used to that. Daniel thrived in conversation. In persuasion. In presence. But paperwork? Process? Silence? Those were different terrains. And he was unprepared. You've changed, he said during one of our last direct conversations. I didn't deny it. I've clarified, I replied. That frustrated him more, because it implied something simple. I had always been capable of this. I had just chosen not to be. Until now. The sixth consequence arrived as confirmation. The secondary account, his account, was no longer accessible. Not frozen. Closed. Legally. By him. That told me two things. First, he knew exposure was inevitable. Second, he was trying to contain damage. But closure doesn't erase history. It only signals awareness. My attorney reviewed the records. "This works in your favor," she said. "I know," I replied. "Are you prepared for court?" I considered that. Not emotionally. Practically. Yes. Because by then, this wasn't about discovery. It was about conclusion. And conclusions require evidence, which I had, in full. The seventh consequence unfolded publicly. Not dramatically, but definitively. Daniel was placed on administrative leave. Pending review. No announcement. Just absence. But absence speaks. Especially in professional environments built on visibility. Colleagues notice. Speculation grows. Narratives shift. He called once more. "They think I'm hiding something," he said. I didn't respond immediately. Then, "Aren't you?" I asked. Silence. Longer this time. Because now, the question wasn't rhetorical. It was reflective. And he didn't have an answer that helped him. The eighth consequence was personal. I visited the apartment again. Not to confront. To confirm. It was empty. Cleared. Efficiently. No traces of occupancy. Except structure. Furniture outlines. Faint impressions. A space that had existed. And then been erased. I walked through each room slowly. Not searching. Just observing. 3 years of separation. Hidden in plain sight. Funded by deception. Maintained by assumption. I stood by the window for a moment, then turned and left, locking the door behind me, not out of obligation, but closure, because whatever had been there was no longer relevant. The ninth consequence arrived in court. Not dramatic, not theatrical, precise, documented, final. The judge reviewed the evidence thoroughly. Transfers, account structures, unauthorized movement within legal boundaries, but in violation of marital agreements. That distinction mattered. Daniel's attorney argued intent, positioning, misunderstanding. But intent doesn't override documentation. And positioning doesn't erase pattern. The ruling was clear. Asset redistribution. Penalties. Full financial disclosure. In my favor. Daniel didn't look at me. Not once. And I didn't need him to. Because this wasn't about him anymore. It was about resolution. And resolution had been achieved. The 10th consequence came quietly. Weeks later. A message. Short. Direct. I didn't think you would go this far. I read it once. Then set the phone down. Because distance had already been established. There was nothing left to respond to. No explanation required. No closure needed. He had his answers. He had always had them. He just hadn't expected me to act on mine. Reinvention doesn't arrive all at once. It builds. Like everything else. I moved into a smaller home. Not out of necessity. Out of intention. Simpler. Clearer. Mine. I reopened a consulting branch I had paused years earlier. Corporate financial analysis. Strategic risk. Pattern recognition. Work that required exactly what I had learned to trust again. Myself. Clients came steadily. Then consistently. Then by referral. Because clarity is valuable and rare. Lillian visited often. Not out of obligation. Out of understanding. "I see it now," she said one evening. See what? How easy it was to believe him. I nodded. "People trust confidence," I said. "Even when it's misplaced." She looked around the room. "You're different here." I smiled slightly. "I'm accurate here." That was the difference. Not stronger. Not harder. Just aligned. With truth. With structure. With myself. Months passed. Quietly. Productively. Peace isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It settles. Into routines. Into decisions. Into space. I stopped thinking about Daniel entirely. Not intentionally. Naturally. Because relevance fades when connection ends. And in its place. something else grows.
Clarity, autonomy.
Stability. Not dramatic, but lasting. Looking back, the moment that changed everything wasn't the party, or the account, or even the discovery. It was the decision. The quiet shift from asking to verifying, from trusting blindly to observing clearly. Daniel didn't lose everything because I exposed him. He lost everything because he believed I wouldn't. And in that belief, he underestimated the one variable he never accounted for.
Me.
I didn't raise my voice. I didn't chase explanations. I didn't need to. Because truth, when documented carefully enough,
Does the work for you.
and in the end, this was never about proving him wrong. It was about finally choosing to stand in what I knew was right, and building a life that no longer required permission to exist.